بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم. السلام عليكم. يعني بداية أنا سعيد جدا بوجودي في منتدى الأحساء للاستثمار، وأود أن أبدأ بشكر صاحب السمو الملكي الأمير سعود بن نايف أمير المنطقة الشرقية راعي هذا المنتدى، والشكر موصول للزملاء والزميلات في غرفة الأحساء على هذا التنظيم الرائع والمميز، ولشركة أرامكو السعودية وبقية الرعاة. احنا نستأذنكم، الورشة بتكون باللغة الإنجليزية، لكن أظن أنه في يعني ترجمة فورية في الموجودة عند المقاعد. It's always a pleasure to be in the largest oasis in the world, attending the الأحساء Investment Forum with a distinguished panelists we have today, discussing an important topic around corporate governance. We have this panel today is organized by the National Center for Family Businesses and GCC BDI. We have distinguished speakers. We have with us today Sonny Hong, who is the Chief Investment Officer for Soho Global Holdings, the family office of a 50-plus-year-old Asian shipping and retail and real estate family with a heavy focus in technology investing. He has around 30 years of work experience in the tech industry, spanning tech hedge fund management, venture capital investments, tech equity research, tech companies, and he himself is a tech entrepreneur. We've got also Mr. Harindra Kalith, who is the Senior Director for PwC within the Middle East. Harindra leads the corporate governance practice within the GCC, and he's specialized in advising large corporations around GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. We are also pleased to have Peter Aylwin, who's the Director of Ethos Holding, an international private family investment office. He is also an international entrepreneur, investor, and he's the director of a large family office that focuses on finance, investment, and insurance, as well as pension sectors. We are also lucky to have Dr. Abdullah Al-Abdelgader with more than 30 years of experience in corporate governance, auditing, capital markets. He sits on the board of SAMA, as well as GUSI, and a good number of large GCC and Saudi corporations. He's also one of the founding fathers of the CMA, and one of the first. He was also a member of the first committee that established the corporate governance codes within the kingdom. I would like to start our session around governance with Peter. Peter, we know now that there are so many changes across the globe. There is the global wealth transfer across the generations. This is not related to the kingdom or the GCC. It's a global phenomena. We've got so many changes across the globe. How does that impact corporate governance, and do we need corporate governance to ensure for a safe transfer of wealth and to navigate these changes across the globe? Can we take your take as an international investor?
Certainly, it'd be an honor. Well, look, in particular, just to elaborate what the great wealth transfer is, it's actually happening right now. We have the largest transfer of generational wealth in history at this very moment. In the USA alone, it's about 68 trillion between now and 2060. Depending upon the statistics you want to believe, it's between 30 and 40 trillion globally over the next decade. Now, at the apex of this phenomenon are the family offices, which are basically families with usually a single family office, or they're part of a multi-family office with investable assets of over 100 million US dollars. And of course, the ultra high net worth community with in excess of $30 million. And the interesting phenomenon about this transfer of people going from family businesses where they would have the traditional holding at the top and just invest with returns and dividends is now they're forming specific investment offices, really in response to, of course, they're feeling a disalignment of interest with private banks, with asset managers and other third-party consultants. So they want their own team that understands them specifically. And look, depending upon the stats you believe, there's well in excess of 10,000 single-family offices. I think it's more like double that. And what's an intriguing statistic is, of course, WealthX estimates there's over $35.5 trillion amongst the ultra-high net worth individual community. Where this is really important to, of course, the GCC globally, and then where governance plays a major situation, is they're often the initial catalytic investors in segments they believe in, because they're entrepreneurial in their DNA, many of them. But there are differences, of course, and we've got the patriarchal generation and the next-gen children. Patriarchs can be multi-gen, like in Europe, there are families that have been around for 10 or 15 generations. And now they're more in the money management phase and they're more financially sophisticated. US, they're usually no more than 4 gens. And here, of course, in the GCC, there can be 4th gen, 3rd gen, 2nd gen, 1st. And look, they have different investment approaches, which affects the governance substantially, because generally the patriarchal generation look at a more industrial type of industries, such as industrial areas, real estate, operating businesses, shares, bonds. And there's a huge concentration of wealth there, but now there's innovation occurring around this. But the next gen are very, very different in that they're more tech savvy. They really want to know what they're investing in and what the initiative is. Like, what does it mean and what does it stand for? In addition, of course, ESG and social impact investments are a key part of their passion and their portfolio review. And of course, they're much, much more international because they've had the opportunity to be educated abroad. They've got access to social media that even 20 years ago we didn't have. And segueing into sort of the governance, succession planning is a major, major component of this, particularly with the family constitution, which lists, of course, and details how particularly the funds are managed, but also other areas of lifestyle, philanthropy, social impact, etc. There's also family councils that can be formed, where, of course, it brings all of the family together on an annual or biannual basis, which of course, is a pivotal part of proper succession planning. And there are different approaches to maintain wealth. Of course, there's wealth preservation, but of course, embedded into a number of these succession plans and councils, you've also got to look at growth initiatives and, of course, encouraging entrepreneurship. I could elaborate more about the E plus ESG initiative, but I'll probably save that for later. But in short, governance is a pivotal component, and it will basically determine whether or not, and there's an old saying in the West, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. But the better planned family offices and family businesses with that succession plan ensures that the proper stewardship of this wealth, both for the family's benefit and the community at large, is maintained and done so in the most optimal way.
Well, you've made an interesting point around the importance of governance and how it relates to, or how it solves basically for the changes we have at the moment. I would like to also hear Harindra's take around this. You have been advising companies around corporate governance and focusing on GRC model, right, where you focus on governance, risk and compliance. Can you give us a little bit of an insight how this model can help companies navigate the future, and especially as they become bigger and have more subsidiaries to manage?
That's a great question, Nath. What we are seeing more and more in the Saudi economy is that there is an oversupply of risk that organizations need to deal with. Yeah? And we're talking about supply chain issues and macroeconomic and political instability and so on. But among all that, what we've seen more and more in recent years is that organizations are now beginning to focus on 2 key areas of their risk management. One is the risk associated with their various subsidiary companies. And the other aspect of this is how you integrate governance, risk, and compliance, because ultimately, an integrated and holistic view of how you take those forward is how you will manage your risk, which is ultimately what corporate governance is all about. With respect to both these concepts, what we see is that organizations have traditionally taken a very siloed view. When I say siloed, a very sort of individualistic view of how to manage their governance. You'll either have governance sitting with the board function or the board secretariat. Risk might be sitting with the CFO. Compliance might be with the legal. And that causes deep risks, because what happens is that you might have risks that just fall through the cracks. Nobody tracks them, nobody knows where they are. Yeah? And for that reason, what we've seen is that the large sovereign wealth funds, for example, the large corporates, have now started very strongly supporting a view that we need to get this right. We need to put in place the systems, the structures, the processes, the people in place to ensure that GRC is managed not in individual silos, but as an integrated whole. Right? And subsidiary governance is just another risk. So, it is a risk that the GRC function can handle. It will be handled either by the governance team or the risk team or the compliance team, but it's all interconnected.
Great. The importance of, I just have one quick follow-up question for you, Harindra. One of the things we always hear is that, well, okay, we see the value of GRC, we understand that it can add value to the company, but what about, is it worth it? What's the cost and benefit analysis you would normally observe?
Look, I mean, the cost is just incalculable, because if you get that right, you're actually saving on potential financial loss, reputational loss, ethics breaches, and so on. So it's very hard to quantify, but if you get it right, you do a lot of good things, and you save a lot of embarrassment for yourself and your organization in the future.
So in a sense, it's similar to an insurance policy, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It's very, very good points. Sony, can I move a little bit to you and hear your perspective around I understand that you are an international investor. You invest in many countries in Asia, in the States, and so forth. And you consider so many factors before stepping into one country to invest, right? Is corporate governance part of that matrix, part of the items you look at? If you can give us some idea around this, and what do you look at in this front?
Sure. Thank you, Doctor. So the global capital markets is roughly a $240 trillion market. And if you look at the US markets, it's a little bit over half that. It's 50%. That's mostly the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and the debt capital markets in the United States. And the question is, why is that? And I think a big part of that is really good corporate governance, both on the country level and the company level. If you look at it on the country level, there's a whole regulatory body from SEC to filing requirements to law firms. It's really towards building shareholder value creation and then protecting it. On the company level, I mean, we could go through all the different rules, but at one point in 2006 to 2009, I used to be an active investor on Wall Street. And not to say that active investing is important, but in the US, there is this fiduciary obligation to protect shareholder value. And we have levers to keep management honest. I think, I've tried to go activist on Dutch companies. It's very difficult. I think maybe UK and US are ones where it's much easier. But it's not about going activist in markets. It's that there are fiduciary levers for investors to take management out if things aren't going correctly. So I think a big part of why the US capital markets are so deep and healthy is because of this corporate governance. I'm not saying that corporate governance solves everything, but it almost, you can say, is a prerequisite for these deep, healthy capital markets. And I think deep, healthy capital markets are very important for the development of all countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the GCC. If you just go through some of the other things that I look at as an investor, obviously corporate governance is very important, but large addressable markets are very important. Sustainable competitive advantages that country can develop, other industry dynamics, regulatory alignment. And one of the things that really excited me about Saudi Arabia is, this is actually my first trip, and it was more to kind of get a lay of the land and the opportunity set. I'm a big tech investor. And after coming here, it's so exciting what's going on. The energy you can feel, the amount of change, the excitement and the hope in both the young people and the older generation. And you can kind of see that this is a huge wave that's about to start. So, I mean, to me, it's just very exciting to be here. And I went from being a spectator to potentially investing a large sum of capital and starting an incubator or some way and putting serious capital into the Saudi market. And I think if I tell a lot of my friends, and if they actually experience this, I think they'll think the same. But going back to the corporate governance conversation, I think if you look at other markets like Asia and South Korea, they're still not as developed as the US market in corporate governance. But I think they're slowly learning to do that because you want deep capital markets. That's how you develop, one of the ways you develop the economy. And I think there's a lot of lessons that Saudi Arabia and Middle East can learn from Asia. Not to make the same mistakes that Asia did, but I think they learned that some of the things that they adopted from the West and from the US were very applicable to them. And I think, my hope is that the GCC can grow with Asia and become these dominant forces. I think the only other thing I want to add is, on the company level and the country level, it needs to be all aligned. But I came from Wall Street where everything's aligned in terms of creating shareholder value. It's always your fiduciary obligation as a board member, as a CEO, as an employee is to increase shareholder value, plus what other objectives the company has, usually to create shareholder value. Like even if it's ESG, it's usually because it's shareholder value. The one thing I've learned since running a family office is the goals are not set in a family office. So in a company like Microsoft where I worked, our goal is to increase shareholder value. In a family office, a lot of the shareholders have different goals. It's not just about shareholder value. It can be anything from, they have different skill sets, they have different risk levels, they have different lifestyles. So, and some of them want to just do ESG or impact investing, some don't. So from that aspect, the corporate governance I find in a family business really interesting, and it's just, you're starting over, and there's just so much dynamics and emotions that's involved with it. I think the professor, the doctor is much more of an expert on that than I, but it's something I find very interesting.
Yeah, well, this is very deep insight from international exposure you have. I second what you mentioned about the growth we have within the kingdom. I think this year we are one of the fastest growing economies within the G20. And I think with Vision 2030 and the tremendous work that's happening across all sectors, we are expected to observe, inshallah, more growth in the future. And there is good potential for many investors across the globe to participate in this growth in the future. Yeah. I just want to, you've mentioned that we've got family level governance, we've got corporate level governance, and then the countrywide level governance, right? I want to take that point and move to Dr. Abdullah, who's, as I mentioned, one of the founding fathers for governance within the kingdom, and just take his insight around the journey of corporate governance within the kingdom and what's the state of corporate governance now.
Thank you, Dr. Aad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen. I was having conflicting thought regarding should I start in English or in Arabic. And my colleague, I think they wanted in English, so I'm not sure. If you allow me, I would like to speak in Arabic. Yeah, for the sake of most of the audience. And let's remember that our objective is to emphasize the importance of the governance. فبسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد عليه وعلى آله أفضل الصلاة والتسليم.
Peter, you can put the headset.
حقيقة أنا سعيد بالمشاركة وأقدم فائق الشكر والتقدير لكل من ساهم ويساهم في تنظيم هذا الملتقى ولدفع عملية الاستثمار في بلدنا الحبيب واحتنا الحبيبة الأحساء. الحوكمة بمفهومها الحقيقي هي دافعة ومشجعة للاستثمار. من لديه أموال يستثمرها يجب أن يستثمرها في شركات تتحلى بقدر كبير من الحوكمة والانضباط المؤسسي. هذا الكلام يبدو أنه أصبح معتادا في وقتنا الحاضر، لكن قبل 18 سنة كان مفهوما غريب على الكثير حتى من أصحاب الأعمال من لهم خبرات كبيرة فيه. الحوكمة بمفهومها عندما بدأت في 2005 بنشر أول لائحة لها، بدأت إلى حد كبير على استحياء، لأن هيئة السوق المالية كان لديها لائحة مفصلة وجيدة للإدراج، وتحتوي على كثير من الالتزامات على من يريد أن يدرج شركته في السوق، ومتطلبات كثيرة للإفصاحات، وهي الحقيقة تصب في مفهوم الحوكمة بمفهومها الواسع. لكن هناك مبادئ أساسية للحوكمة معروفة على مستوى العالم، وليست قواعد تنفيذية ملزمة رأت الهيئة أن تبدأ بها وتقدمها وتطلب من جميع الشركات المدرجة في ذلك الوقت أن تلتزم بهذه المبادئ أو تبرر إفصاحاً في تقاريرها السنوية عن الأسباب التي دعتها إلى عدم الالتزام. عايشنا في الفترة الأولى لوضع اللائحة الكثير حقيقة من التقبل والكثير من عدم التقبل والاعتراض. يعني أريد أن أعطيكم مثالا واحدا: لجنة التعويضات والمكافآت التي أصبحت مفهوما معتادا لدينا الآن، ويمكن كثير منكم سمع عنها ويعمل بها ويريد، لم تكن موجودة البتة في جميع الشركات وجميع الأعمال في المملكة العربية السعودية، بل حتى كثير من الدول بما فيها المنطقة. خلال السنوات 18 الماضية عملت هيئة السوق المالية حقيقة على تطوير اللائحة والارتقاء بها بما يتناسب مع نمو السوق ونضجه، إلى درجة أنها أصبحت لدينا الآن لائحة أقدر أقول أنها هي من أحسن اللائحات على مستوى العالم. لكن القفزة الكبيرة حصلت حقيقة تزامناً مع الخطط الطموحة والبرامج الكثيرة المصاحبة لرؤية سيدي ولي العهد الأمير محمد بن سلمان فيجن 2030 أو رؤية 2030. لماذا؟ ما علاقتها بالحوكمة؟ أصبح بوجود هذه الرؤية تناغم كبير في المنظومة التشريعية من جميع الجهات، سواء هيئة السوق المالية ابتداءً أو وزارة المالية، وزارة التجارة، وزارة الاستثمار، البنك المركزي. فأصبح لدينا الآن منظومة تشريعية كاملة تمثل في نظري نضجاً كاملاً في مفهوم الحوكمة. بمعنى عندما تنظر إلى نظام السوق، نظام الشركات صدر ولم يحدث أكثر من حوالي 18 سنة أو 20 سنة. صدر الإصدار الثاني منه قبل 7 سنوات، قبل أيام تم تطبيق الإصدار الجديد، وكلها تحتوي على تطبيقات جدا رائعة لمفاهيم الحوكمة. البرامج القطاع المالي في رؤية 2030 وفتح السوق المالية السعودية، الاستثمار الأجنبي، الحرص على استقطاب الاستثمارات الذي لن يتأتى كما تفضل زميلي قبل قليل إلا بوجود حوكمة، إطار حوكمة للشركات التي يراد أن يستثمر بها. فنحمد الله سبحانه وتعالى على ما تم تحقيقه من إنجازات في هذا المجال، وأنا حقيقة سعيد برؤيتكم واهتمامكم في هذا، لأنه الحوكمة الجيدة وأتمنى أن تطبق في جميع الشركات صغيرها وكبيرها، العائلية منها والخاصة العامة والمقفلة، يعني مدعاة حقيقة للفخر. وأعتذر لزملائي من يتكلمون باللغة الإنجليزية لعلهم إن شاء الله يتابعوني.
I'm quite sure they got what you said with the translation. يعني Dr. Abdullah, you've mentioned يعني you gave us an interesting timeline how corporate governance evolved across the years. And we observe the impact of that with the depth of the local market. Now, the local market within the kingdom is the deepest market within the MENA region and most liquid, most transparent. And all of this is basically the fruit of the improvement that we have observed in the regulations. Peter, I want to come back to you a little bit. You've mentioned that we've got different generations with different interests. So you've got, there is conflicts of interest around, for example, the investment. Some generations want to invest in the base economy, and others are more keen to observe or to experiment with the new technologies and the new methodologies. Around dividend policy, some of them want to reduce their dividend policy to finance their growth, and the other just want to have more to spend on their lives. How does corporate governance help in solving these conflicts? Does it help in that?
Yes, it certainly does. And just giving an international perspective, of course, for some of the older generational multifamily offices, of course, they've had those rules in place, so they're more in the money management phase. But because there's been such an explosion of family business success, if you just look at Asia now, and particularly China, it's a very, very new phenomenon to put a family office in place. Because some of their wealth would take a regular family 2, 3, 4 generations to accumulate. Some of them have done it in the last 20 years because of the explosion of that market. So look, learning from that and the role, it really is absolutely pivotal, because what it does, it puts the parameters, the direction, the strategy, and of course the guidance in place in which to go forward. What is key, however, for the next generation is to allow flexibility for them to, in quote unquote, do their own thing. And I'm seeing that phenomenon here amazingly here in Saudi Arabia. I've been, of course, coming to the region for 15 years and living most winters here. I would have loved to have set up in Saudi a lot earlier, and now with these sort of new generation coming in, much easier to get visas, I really see an extraordinary explosion and hunger from the next generation, but also the patriarchal generation, to collaborate, co-create and co-elevate with other family offices, with other businesses, and even at the institutional level. The interesting situation that we're in now, where the next generation are really fueling this social impact investing, because that's something they really feel that they can take and make it a part of their own story, their own legacy. Because when you've got a very successful father, mother, and family, it's almost like a feeling of suffocation, particularly if it's a first gen where they're an operating company. And in some cultures, for example, Asia, India, etc., and of course here, there's almost an obligation to the family to be honored to run the family business. But a lot of the Western family offices actually allow a lot of freedom for them to go out into the workforce, learn their own thing, and then at the opportunity come back later on with other skill sets. And in some cases, there's also, they do divide. And the issue to pay attention to here in the GCC is because families are generally a lot larger. The importance of governance is to get the succession planning in place now while the patriarch is alive, and make sure it's very, very clear the role that each person should play, ideally, and of course would like to play, because certain people have different skill sets. And for example, there's many families I know where the children have no interest in investments, no interest in business. They just want to be artists, they want to be philanthropists, they want to travel the world, which can be fine, but you've got to see, does the family office and governance sustain that, or will it actually dilute the family wealth? And also some of the large family asset management families from abroad that have become wealth managers, they're heavily in a preservation mode, which I feel is a little bit contradictory to the attitude here in the GCC, because there's still an entrepreneurial spirit. The succession is still fairly young. A lot of the wealth was from the 40s, 50s, 60s, from some of the initial industrialists and oil families here. So there is, what I've really seen embraced, and this can actually be for your advantage, not disadvantage. Don't think you're behind. With so much progress happening in Saudi now, so much opening up, you have the power of hindsight, ladies and gentlemen, of learning from the mistakes of the West. And that's where I like the 3 C's: collaboration, co-creation, and co-elevation. Because there's an old saying, a smart person learns from their own mistakes, but a much smarter person learns from the mistakes of others.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I hope we do learn from the mistakes of others. You've, in your comment, you've mentioned, at least the way I understood your chain of thoughts is there are issues and corporate governance tries to solve for them, to predict these issues and to put some mechanisms to solve for them. Harindra, you've been advising companies to implement corporate governance structures. How do you do that? What are the key elements you focus on when you design corporate governance structure for a corporation? Can you give us some insight?
So that's a good question, but a very broad question, Dr. Raith. Corporate governance means so much to so many different people. It really just depends on who you ask. But, in its simplest form, it obviously starts off with establishing the right tone from the top, a very familiar term that everybody is aware of. And this means setting expectations in terms of the strategy, the vision, the values by the board of directors, right? The board will typically appoint committees of various types, obviously critical that they are empowered, you have the right mix of people sitting in those committees with the right skills and are aware of their roles and responsibilities. Yeah. But there's governance at two levels. There's, of course, the corporate governance element at the level of the board and so on, but there's also operational level governance. Yeah? And that's something not to be forgotten because many organizations just sort of have the token board of directors and you have the token committees, but that's not where it ends. Because if you don't sort of push that sentiment or you don't push that approach down towards the middle management and towards the lower management, then all your corporate governance efforts are going to be wasted, right? So what does operational governance really involve? And why should families and large corporates focus on it? At its simplest level, it's things like a delegation of authority, for example, right? In large corporates, maybe private businesses even, there's not enough clarity on who's taking decisions and how, right? And that's a danger for most businesses. It's around aligning your policies and procedures. It's around ensuring that you have the correct reporting mechanisms in place, that you're reporting the right things back to your management. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think it's very insightful. So you start with the tone of the top, which is basically setting a culture of accountability, then an appropriate structure presented by a good board and committees, and then you've got the policies and procedures governing the operation of the company. Sony, can you add something to the conversation? What do you think we've missed around the conversation? You have an exposure, you've seen corporate governance codes in several countries. What do you think, what can you shed light on this?
Thank you, Doctor. So I think in terms of corporate governance, when you look at a lot of the other jurisdictions, they're borrowing a lot of the concepts from the West, but they're also internalizing it. So definitely, I think America's kind of pursuit for shareholder value creation and protecting the shareholders' rights is very important. And I think places like Singapore, Japan, and Korea are pretty far along within that dimension. China's following along. But all around the world, there is that underlying thing where you have a lot of protections. Obviously, there's a lot of history and local cultures that you have to also deal with. And I think each jurisdiction's kind of figuring out what is the right level to do it at. But I think like what I was talking about before, the biggest differences you really see from the country and company level is when you really start getting to family offices. And from that level, it's a clean slate. You're really dealing with different personalities. And it's not just about making money. It's about what you want, what the second generation or third generation wants. And as Peter was talking about the great wealth transfer, a lot of these people will be controlling up to $36 trillion of assets. And all of that has to be redesigned. So it's almost like a new paradigm for corporate governance, designing what is the correct level of corporate governance. The other thing I would add is, when I used to be a hedge fund manager, I think my investors were like, Harvard Management or Duke Endowment. These are some of the most sophisticated investors in the world. And to them, their mandate to me is, we trust you, so go invest in any asset class, any geography in the world. And their mandate is, we have checks and balances, but we're going to give you the freedom. So there is an element where you have to have balance, where you have to have great corporate governance, but the more you also have restrictions, the more restrictive it could get. So there is a checks and balance that you have to manage. And within the family office, you have to understand that checks and balance and each person's individual desires of how much they want to work, how much risk level they're willing to take. There are some family members where I'm very comfortable with risk, but there's some family members where they just want to clip a coupon on a fixed income product. And they don't understand investing in venture capital firms right now may be very opportune or things like that. So I think it really is all across the board amongst all different types of structures, countries, jurisdictions today.
It's interesting. So basically, you've got the initial corporate governance, and then after that, you've got some trade-offs, right?
Yes.
Whether you go further or it's not adding additional value. Dr. Abdullah, do you have something to add before we move to the audience? Can you elaborate on what we've heard?
شكرا.
In Arabic or in English?
Again in Arabic, إن شاء الله. الحوكمة أنا أعتقد تعتبر الرحلة. إذا ما بدأتها في البزنس حقك وكنت من الجيل الأول، أعتقد عندك وقت بس ابدأها، حتى لو كانت بخطوات قصيرة. إن كنت من الجيل الثاني للعائلة، أعتقد أنك تحتاج إلى التسريع في ذلك بشكل كبير، لأنه هو بناء ثقافة داخل المؤسسة أو البزنس أو العمل الذي تقوم به باستقطاب استثمار فيها أو ضمان إلى حد كبير بإذن الله بقائها للأجيال المتعاقبة. الزملاء في هذا البانل أو في هذا الحوار أشاروا إلى فائدة الحوكمة من وجهة نظر المستثمر، فائدة الحوكمة للشركات العائلية، الخطوات الأساسية لمنظومة الحوكمة. فأعتقد أن الوقت جدا مناسب، وخصوصا نحن عندنا الآن بيئة في البلد جاذبة للاستثمار، ويجب أن يرقى طموحنا كرجال أعمال، وأنا أوجه هذه الكلمة لهم، أنه إلى طموح فيجن 2030 الرؤية 2030، وضمن إطارها على أن تكون مؤسسة بإطار حوكمة واضح. مثلا إذا سمحتوا لي، من المهم جدا لأي عمل كما أشير هنا إلى وضع خطة للتعاقب. لا نريد أن نفقد مكتسبات وطنية من شركات عائلية كبيرة تذهب أدراج الرياح نتيجة عدم وجود خطط تعاقب وعدم وقوف الجيل المؤسس أو الجيل الثاني لبناء أعمدة لبقائها في المستقبل. هذا ما أريد أن أقول. شكرا.
الله يعطيك العافية. I would like now to take a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, please.
السلام عليكم. مساء الخير. I'm really excited with this topic in this forum. My question is very simple, The corporate governance, I think one of the pillars of the corporate governance is the board of the directors. In my opinion, I've been through a lot of experience with the board of directors that unfortunately many of the board of directors, they take this job or this role or this responsibility. I hope my voice is clear to you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. They take this as, a prestige role more than, to add value in terms of, serious responsibility of being a board member of an organization. I want to clarify what I mean by the prestige, that, when you are at the top, excellent example, the tone of the top, it's very important. So just a few days back, I was discussing the conflict of interest of the, board of directors. We appoint, in many companies, independent, non-executive directors. Unfortunately, these ones who they compose, full of 10 board of directors, they don't know what is conflict of interest of their job. Easily, simply, blindly, they do, they do things that they see it, a board member is doing it. We as a management, we follow what they do. So I just want to emphasize that awareness of conflict of interest, a system, how to prevent or enhance the conflict of interest by the board of directors, specifically independent, non-executive directors. I don't see it much there to be emphasized. Nobody declares, the conflict of interest, and it's like, nobody's telling them that you should have declared that before, you have taken an action or a decision on such and such matter. Thank you so much.
I think the question is clear, and it's around to a large extent around the effectiveness of board of directors in carrying their fiduciary duty. Do you want, Dr. Abdullah, do you want to comment or?
Well, the intention of having regulations or principles and workshops like these is to straighten the work, the conduct, and the dynamic of the boards. Now, and the board is the most fundamental, I would say, body for good governance. And there are, of course, sometimes some ignorance, some lack of knowledge, lack of experience from some of board members, which happens everywhere. But thanks for institutions like GCCBDI, where the role of the board is to be clarified through workshops, through building community, and also the other apparatus for making the board more effective. So this kind of prestigious or status kind of positions of the board actually is the opposite situation now. The fiduciary responsibility of the board members, especially in listed companies, is horrendous and liable for a number of years even after the expiration of the board. So you need to show as board member, especially if you are independent board member, that you have that you did the due care and the professional conduct to alleviate any legal responsibility that might fall on your shoulders maybe after 5 or 10 years when you leave that board membership.
Very good points, and I could also add to them the practice of board evaluation, which is mandated now within the kingdom, and by that they check whether the board is functioning appropriately or not. Can we take one with Jane?
Thank you, panelists, and thank you for your question, sir. Very happy to help your directors better understand their duties and responsibilities. At the GCC Board Directors Institute, we work with a lot of private companies, listed companies, but also large private companies, family businesses. But it is difficult to persuade them very often that they need to improve their governance. And I would just like to ask, maybe Sonny, maybe Peter, but also Dr. Abdullah, if I may, what would your recommendation be to them? Why should they adopt good governance practices?
Well, I'm looking at this from both a family investor perspective, but really, because of the institutional side, I really think this can be an extraordinary opportunity for Saudi Arabia. If they ask themselves really a couple of questions, number one, what do we wish to be best at in the region? And more importantly, what do we wish to be number one at in the world? And if you wish to be the destination of choice, then proper governance is unequivocally most pivotal. And at the institutional area, it's very much, for example, from an investment perspective, a checklist of certain criteria. If something, for example, is not this, and this, the institutions just are not allowed to invest. And when you look at it, even at your own sovereign fund of PIF, they've got very, very specific portfolios that are only allocated for specific reasons. So in your own best interests and to give yourself a head start, and it's not that difficult to start, and with GCC, BDI and other, of course, experts accessible through their channel, it can really give you that framework at your own pace to look at where you want to go. And I always believe in begin with the end in mind. Where do you want to be? And what is the blue ocean strategy to get there? And by that I mean, blue ocean means where there's an opportunity where there's not too many people. Whereas a red ocean strategy means there's a lot of sharks fighting one another, trying to compete. You've got that golden opportunity now, and so that structure of governance, I would ask myself, is this a small, medium, large business, family office, or indeed the integration of, and this is where the GCC is very, very strong, and there are a lot of moving parts that you really can capitalize upon, is where there's government, where there's regulation, institutional investors, but they're still very connected to industry and family offices here, because the family businesses really were the engine that created the innovation and the industrialization. So with that framework, I think you can show an even greater confidence to foreign investors that you're safe, you're protected, we understand your investment criteria, and let's be long-term partners. I think that's the message that His Highness MBS and everyone here is wanting to attract, and it's just a matter of course, afterwards, can you collaborate, co-create, and co-elevate together?
Sonny, do you want to add?
Yeah, I just have something to add. I think Peter is 100% correct. I mean, there has to be, and I would say even an ecosystem that has to be built. And that doesn't take months, that takes decades. And I think that idea of having, there's all these companies that rate things, right? S&P 5 or S&P or Moody's rates fixed income products. There's Cambridge Associates that rates funds. But you need this type of, I guess, system in place for board of directors, especially for earlier developments of these types of structures. When I say ecosystem, it's not just making sure that they understand they have a fiduciary obligation. It needs to go all the way to the point where investors have rights to sue board members. I mean, I've taken over boards and taken over the decision-making of the management because the board was not, obligating to their fiduciary responsibilities. And like a lot of times when activists do an activist campaign, it's not to take over the board. It's very costly to get into a fight and take over the board. It's that you have the threat to be able to do that to protect your interests. And only time shareholders ever vote towards your campaign is when it's so egregious. So I think there's a ecosystem that needs to be evolved, and I think Peter's idea is right on. Right now, that's probably the most pressing thing that needs to be done for good corporate governance.
And for that ecosystem, just to add as well, Singapore have been making great moves with a private wealth institute, but you can do this in a sectorized way. Peers want to meet other peers of equal stature, etc. And again, if you have, for example, even I got a friend of mine who has an association where he flies in on behalf of governments, say 20 billionaires into that country. And then they have a roundtable for a couple of days, and then they talk about the changes they'd like to make and the collaborations. But really what they're doing is they're thinking of a framework of governance on how to work together. So I think if you also cherry pick where you wish to be successful into the future, and then look at bringing those leaders in to deal at a peer-to-peer level, I think that can be much more effective than, of course, sort of like a mass media type of campaign to say we're here to change, etc. That's needed too, but I think that's what actually moves the institutional wealth, the big private wealth, and makes the leaders of other nations feel comfortable. And that's why I asked the question, what is your Davos, for example? What is your private, because again, wealthy people and leaders, there's some that wish to make their message known to the world and promote themselves, and others are extraordinarily private. They do not want any media, and they wish to just do a peer-to-peer private engagement. And from that, I think those discussions and the guidance of GCC, BDI, and others, you can really develop a great framework for the long term.
Thanks a lot. And I definitely agree with you that institutions that work towards improving corporate governance within the region add lots of value for ensuring that corporate governance best practices are in place and people try to adapt them. I would like just to take one last question before closing the session. Amir? Yes.
Yes. So family business are a big part in Saudi Arabia of critical sector like shipping companies, medical companies, health sector. At what percentage we can say this is dangerous for energy security, for example, food security? Family business are a big part of Saudi market in critical sector like health, like shipping, energy. So how dangerous is that for food security, energy security? And at what percentage of family businesses in this critical sector that's considered a red flag? And is that a bad thing or not?
Okay, Harindra, do you want to comment on that?
I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear the question very well.
Well, basically, what he's saying is that family businesses are, operate across all industries, and they control big part of several industries. How does this impact the security of the supply of goods and services in these industries? So, for example, in the healthcare, you've got big part of the sector owned and operated by family businesses. Does that have a risk? Is it a risk for the sector or opportunity? What is it?
I'm really sorry, Aid. I'm just not able to pick up your question now. I think there's just too much of a gap here. Would maybe somebody else pick up the question? You heard it?
He's saying family businesses are dominant in Saudi culture. And
Can I take this?
Yes, Dr. Abdullah. I'll take Dr. Abdullah and then come back to you.
Okay.
Dr. Abdullah.
I was just telling him I could hear, but the echo was a little bit difficult. In terms of corporate governance, I mean, I think that has to start at the country level, right? Like regulatory. Food security is a very important thing, but it's a national kind of endeavor because, like, companies their job is to increase efficiency. Their job is to, target markets, but they don't necessarily see the overarching. So I think food security and corporate governance has to start at the country level and have to be a coordinated effort is my thoughts. But I mean, obviously every market's a little bit different.
We are going to take just one response from His Excellency Engineer Abdul Latif Athman, and then we are going to close the session, inshallah.
Shukran jazilan. Thank you very much. I think the question relates to antitrust and competition on the family businesses that are involved into multi-sectors. And in the kingdom, there is the General Authority of Competition that ensures issues like competition, antitrust, food security, or any practices that could jeopardize the economy that are addressed. It's not per se the governance of the individual institutions, but rather it's a regulatory side on the government that addresses the concern that was raised.
I think I'll just comment for that and then close the session. What you've mentioned is definitely important, ensuring that antitrust laws are in place and the competition is fair and it's level playing field for everyone. At the same time also, family businesses represent around 70%, two-thirds of the national private sector. And this is a global phenomena. Perhaps our colleagues from abroad can second that idea. And what we see is that the survival rate for family businesses, while many people suggest that it does not last for beyond the second or third generation, these figures are normally not compared to a benchmark of a normal corporation. But what we see is that even if a company fails, normally whether it's a private or family business, what we see is that another company is going to come and bridge that gap. What we need to do as a country and regulations is to ensure that the necessary mechanisms and legal infrastructure for these family businesses to be sustainable in the future are in place. And once we do that, then we've done our part, and then we let it to the market to decide whether a company is competitive enough to continue in the future or not. To that end, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists, Sani, Harindra, Peter, and Dr. Abdullah, and I would also thank our partners at GCC BDI for co-organizing this session with us, as well as our generous hosts at الأحساء chamber. Thanks a lot, and inshallah we see you next year.